So Alan, you've recorded, you know, the amount of range of styles of music has been broad in your career, and I think, you know, just talking about recording drums for a minute, you know, because I'm sure you've ambient, dead, in between, et cetera, et cetera. Where do you start? Give us some of what's your key tips and tricks if you're walking into a session?
You know, in the early era, of course, obviously, you know, working with a band, you know, and so I used to actually tune all the drums myself, pad them, adjust them, and do the whole thing myself. There's always that issue between keeping the drummer, you know, I said, how can I finesse this without create a disturbance in the force? Because obviously the last thing I want to do is make the drummer feel uncomfortable. But in the same respect, I need to get the end result I need to get. So, and the other thing is, I tend to spend a lot of my time either before the drummer walks in, if I can get everything together before they even enter the door. I was doing an album with Phil Collins in Switzerland, and we were in a castle, and so I had to set up a whole room to record the drums of Phil's drums. And Phil's just the greatest guy in the world, but he doesn't have much, you know, he needs it to be slick and ready to go when it comes in. So finally, we had done some prep tracks. Phil's going to do his drum overdubs. So I spent a lot of time on the headphone mix, and when he walked in once again, and I got in every sound of drums. I mean, it was ready to go. So he walked and he sat down, he put on the headphones, he played the takedown top to bottom. We did one punch, the song was done. He says, Alan.
And you know, when you play to a great mix, a drummer, you know, you might, a lot of times, you know, drummers, I've often found that when they're not playing as hard, when they're playing a little bit medium volume, so to say, you get your best tones. So setting up the headphone mix is so critical to that.
Well, I was doing a session with like Vinny Callier, right? Who's a good friend of mine. And I go back, Vinny and I, we met originally, he and Steve I were playing with Zappa. It's the first time we recorded.
Wow.
We go back that far. But anyway, he's doing a session with me, and I can't remember what the session was, and Bobby Columbia's producing, and he finishes the track, he takes the headphones, he throws them on the ground, he says, fuck sides. He was so pissed. He says he's been used to having headphone mixes sound so bad for so long that when he put this on, he's hearing like, you know, verbs, all this stuff. He was just like, God damn it. I forgot.
Right.
I forgot you know, and because the joy of playing.
Right.
Because, you know, once again, doing that live two-track stuff, you know, what I would do on one of those big dates where you get all these players is I have everybody in pre when they walk in, just so they've got a headphone mix. We do a take. And the second I had a good mix on the board, I flip them over to my mix. So they're hearing the finished record.
Cool.
And so they're playing, and it makes it 10 times easier for me to mix because they're adjusting to what they're hearing, and everything is balanced.
And they're playing to if you're compressing, they're playing to the compression, they're playing to the reverb, and that's it. That's the point. It's like you play to the mix, and it creates a better track, you know, as a result.
Well, I also got into like with Keltner, he enjoyed the sound of compression as a side chain. So I used to like the Orange County, I made a custom version of an Orange County stereo compressor, which is similar to the ADR Complex. Sure. Even a little more interesting in certain respects. And so I would take a mult off the overheads and then a secondary mult off of the room mics, and I have that on separate tracks.
Okay.
And so all the attack is untouched. And I stick that in, and it gives you this roar of a floor, but with all of the punch is still intact. Because if I put a compressor across the whole mess, obviously I'm losing all the attacks. And so the fun factor goes away. Because I'm a punch freak. You can't make it punch enough for me. For me, I'm into expansion, not compression. But I love the roar of all the sustain.
The effect,
You know, and so even if you recorded in, like if you take a mult of the left-right overheads, it's amazing how roomy that can get when you have the, you know, like if I have them 50s, say, for the rooms, it's actually sometimes too roomy. Where I can actually, in like a room like Studio B, which is a relatively light room anyway, if you play just the overheads with no compression, it's fairly dry sounding. But you put the compression as a mult put underneath, all of a sudden it takes on a lot of color.
Yes.
And
right, so you would be multing back then and blending, and you had real good control later on then.
Exactly.
Okay.
You know, because even the same thing when you're mixing overall, I tend never to use bus compressors because it's, you know, if it's a song that's up-tempo from the beginning, doesn't really change much, you can get a threshold that works pretty good and it sounds okay. But unfortunately, if you get something that's dynamic with a big chorus and a bigger bridge, it just kind of turns to mush in the middle. And so if you can use mults and you have compression underneath, and then when I master, I'll do some peak limiting to get the level that I need on the thing. But it leaves me a little room to do something when I master, where otherwise it's completely squashed down to a thing, and there's no fun factor.
Okay.
That's all.
And how do you? What's the simple basics on recording a kick and a snare?
Okay, typically on a kick, you know, nothing too complex. You know, I typically will have an inside and outside mic. I typically use a D112 inside, usually about 6 inches from the beater, aimed directly at the beater inside the drum. And then I'll typically use U47 fat with a windscreen on it. Always with a windscreen, because the air is just going to give you subsonics and stuff that has no relevance and damage the microphone. So I have that outside the microphone. And then usually, when I look at Pro Tools, I may make slight changes in regard to time between those two microphones, depending upon what it is.
For phase, yeah.
But that's, and the other things, oftentimes also, I may take a mult off the D112 and a mult off the 47 fat, and I put it into a DBX 165, and I'll do a thwack sort of thing, where I basically set the attack super slow so that the leading edge comes through and then clamps down afterwards, and then I'll put that on a separate track, which is called a thwack track. And I can have one for each of the two microphones that I can tuck back in for impact if I choose to.
Okay.
Makes it super punchy. But of course the problem is you need to do it while you're recording it, because once you're in the digital domain, if you try to go back digital and go back in again, you can never get it perfectly aligned. It's always slightly off, and there's always a certain amount of phase relationship.
Sure.
So if you're mixing, you can do it after factory mixing, but you can't go back in and back out again. That's all.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And when did you start? What year were you doing that technique?
I was doing a Living Newton-John records with this guy John Farah, and he showed me this thing. And I said, "That's impressive." I mean, you pick things up along the way. He showed me that it's.
So back in the 70s, early 80s.
That was probably the early 80s.
Okay.
I was doing
And what about snare? So what's, trying to get the perfect fat back. Let's say you want the wallet kind of business card vibe snare. What's the trick?
There's a lot of different. It depends on the snare. I mean, if you're going to go simple, right? Let's face it.
Let's say I come in with a superphonic. I got a real nice snare, tune the rings real nice, but I want to pull back a little bit.
Well, what I used to do, I mean, one mode of doing it is the top snare might be an original Silversure 545, not a 57, but a 545, which has a little bit more crispness to it. And so that's my top snare mic. It's on axis, just off the rim, pretty normal position. And then I use a pair of Sony C55Ps in stereo under the snare. Okay.
It's not too elaborate.
Oh no, which is super crunchy and as is crisp. It really sounds great.
Right.
But in an overall kit where you're looking for isolation between the hat and the thing, the 57 still works amazing well. Sometimes an original 451 with 20dB pad and the right windscreen, I also like that. But it depends on the snare. If it's not a super punchy snare, it's not the best mic. If it's got great attack, the 451 works great. Because the 50 cent obviously adds a certain edge to it that we like.
Sure.
And so if there's that, and then there's the thwack, and in fact, sometimes years ago, I used to use Simmons SDS5 drum machine. Yeah. It's an analog synthesizer, but it made great white noise. Yeah. So I'd use a little bit of that white noise underneath,
Blend it in.
That sounded really quite nice.
Cool.
And if it's done tastefully, you never know it's ever there.
Do you ever try setting snares in the room? I remember I learned this from Ron St. Germain in a album we did. He would just turn snares upside down with the rattlers.
Absolutely.
Up. So like he'd hit the snare and all those rattles in the room would take place, and it'd add high end without adding EQ.
Oh, with Cooter, we were doing a thing with Ry Cooter, and same thing, Keltner. And we did about 20 snares in the room upside down, and it was delicious.
Used to record the kick and snare on 2 tracks to.
Well, that's it, because of course, recording on analog tape, and I was very kind of fan of Scotch 250, which had the lowest self noise, and so to get perfect transits coming back, you want the kick and snare coming back with absolute punch. If you're listening to repro and you're just fooling with level, you're looking and you set it for +3, and you're looking and you say, at what level do I record it where it comes back perfectly? And if you want it to come back perfectly, I have to record it, if we set it for +3, it'd probably be -2.5 to have it sound, you have the slightest bit of take compression, but it comes back with ultra punch. If I record it at 0+1, it comes back like mush. So if I have 2 tracks, play them in mono, it cuts the noise in half. So it's like having a half track, 2-track. So I was able to record at that level and get really quiet sound. Wow. So my kick and snare were on a 16-track, recorded 2 channels each, played back in mono. Obviously, as long as you're pan center, you pan left and right, then you get the noise. But as soon as they're pan mono, it cuts the noise in half.
Okay, or cut them in half.
Exactly. Wow. So I do the basics on 16 and then my overdubs on 24, either 1 or 2 24 tracks.